Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on the why and the how of securing Treasury and payments. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by PDG. In order to eliminate any background noise during the presentation, we ask that everyone please keep your microphones muted. This webinar will consist of a 55-minute presentation followed by a 5-minute question and answer session. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat box throughout the webinar. We will answer them when you ask or in the Q&A session. If we do not get to your question, someone from our team will follow up with you. Today's webinar is eligible for CTP and FP&A recertification credits. The credit forms, a copy of the deck, and the recording will be sent via email in the next 7 business days. Our presenter today is Craig Jeffrey, founder and managing partner of Strategic Treasurer. Welcome, Craig. I will now turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Welcome, everyone. Good day. Thank you for taking some time to discuss and listen to a topic on fraud and security, the when and how of securing Treasury and payments. So thank you for your investment of the time. Before I cover the topics that we're going to discuss, today's agenda, if you will, I wanted to talk about several ways of staying engaged. So first, and I'll ask Michelle to copy down some of the links. You can see them in the notes. First is a way of staying connected with us, a relatively new way. It's been out for a few months, is our podcast. We put out a podcast each week now, and we'd love you to download it with whatever device or method you use, whether you come to our website or whatever phone environment you like to listen to podcasts. We would love to hear your comments and ideas for future things. So that's the first, is the podcast. Second, I would love if you connect with us on the LinkedIn page and join and follow the company Strategic Treasurer. You can see the link up in the notes, and it'll be pasted in the screen. I also wanted to emphasize the LinkedIn group Treasury Security. We're sharing information there. Many of you are also a member of our LinkedIn Treasury group, but Treasury Security is a section that focuses on this. Now, within the webinar, there are 2 additional ways to stay connected with us. One is the polling questions. We have 4 of them throughout today's presentation. So there's 4 polling questions for you to answer. This information is not shared to the audience in terms of who answered what, of course, but you can see the summary of what the rest of the audience participants are saying and thinking. So it's very useful to find what people are doing, what they're thinking across a range of topics. Finally, you can see the chat box. People are saying hello, greeting each other. That is a good way to ask questions and follow up there. So with that, I did want to echo my thanks for PDG for sponsoring today's webinar. We have some information at the very end for that. So our agenda is we're going to talk about Treasury situation, really focused on whether it's finance, the bursar's office, or Treasury. What is the situation we find ourselves in? Second, we'll look at the experience we see with fraud, an environment of elevated and escalating fraud activity and the reasons for that. What are people experiencing, and how are losses impacting the organization? Then we're going to move on to assessing the fraud environment. So what's going on in the fraud environment? And we'll look at 2 different areas. So if you've been to some other webinars on fraud, you may have seen us describe the fraud battlefield and the criminal's playbook. How are criminals attacking organizations? What are their main playbooks? And obviously there's variations within their core playbook. And then the fraud battlefield. The 4 major areas that we want to focus on today are shown with a new way of pictorializing that. So once we move off of the assessing the fraud environment, we're going to move on security considerations for IT. So we'll look at IT versus Treasury, or IT versus process, IT versus service considerations, as opposed to only focusing on the IT side of things, looking at the entire process for payments and for protecting an organization's liquid assets. We'll also examine the human versus technology components. Keeping people up to date is a key factor. And then we'll touch on several of the 12 key security principles. Most everyone has some type of security framework that they're familiar with. whether it's related to CARD or an overall IT framework like COBIT. But these are 12 key security principles that we talk about, and we'll touch on a few of those today, give some examples in terms of how we can secure Treasury and payments. We'll touch on some of those key elements. Then we have some final thoughts and takeaways for you to consider in your organization. So with that, we're going to move to our first slide on Treasury situation. So what does Treasury, what does finance, what does the bursar's office run into? What are their challenges? So some organizations experience a lot of globalization. They're doing business in many, many countries. For higher ed, sometimes that's the case as well. They have students and programs that are outside the country. That creates some complexity. Bursar's offices, treasury groups tend to be quite thinly staffed. There's an ongoing onslaught of compliance that has to be addressed. There's not unlimited budget for technology to help with this. Sometimes it's very restricted. Sometimes it comes in waves. But Treasury has a number of elements that increase the complexity they have to address their obligations of providing for capital for the organization, protecting liquid assets. So risk is rising, fraud is rising. The expectations that these groups will protect the organization are significantly elevated. On the left-hand side of the chart, I'm just showing some responses for what organizations are responsible for in Treasury. So that can vary from one organization to another. So you might be responsible for cash positioning and forecasting. Maybe someone else manages liquidity. It might be a separate group. But this is a range of what the coverage areas are. Now, we bring those up to say that there are a range of services and requirements. Second, that there are differences, but there is the core responsibility in any of these areas to provide for capital and to protect the most liquid assets of the organization, to protect the organization against fraud. That is such a core responsibility for any of those areas, and that's why you're on this particular webinar, and that's why we talk about it so much, because it is very much under attack in a systematic way. And when we continue to think about the topic, what are you experiencing with fraud? What are your peers experiencing? And what is your perception on it? This result from a Treasury and Fraud Control Survey. This was our third annual Treasury Fraud and Control Survey we do with Bottom Line Technologies. What's happened? What do we think has happened with the threat level for cyber fraud and payment fraud? And this is the third year we've taken this survey, and I think one thing that's useful to put it in context is most people have been talking about fraud, the elevated level of risk, and how organizations, universities, multinational corporations, medium-sized businesses should protect the organization, so they've increased their defense. So what has happened? Has the threat level increased or decreased? When you look at that, significantly increased and increased are the red and yellow or goldenrod bars there. 84% think it's increased or significantly increased in the past year. That's a massive amount. Stayed the same, 14%, and I like the 1% think it decreased or significantly decreased. So perhaps some organizations put in so many controls. It is awesome, but most everyone feels it's increased or significantly decreased. About 1 in 7 think it stayed the same or perhaps even decreased. So a couple elements there. So it is a clear perception that the level of risk for cyber fraud and payment fraud has increased. Now, let's go to our first polling question. We're going to slide that over. This is about your fraud experience. Before we look at the survey results, let's take a poll of this audience. This is our first poll. All you have to do is click your mouse within the circle that is the most appropriate answer. What is your organization's fraud experience in the past 12 months? No attempts. There's been attempts, but no losses, hopefully. Losses totaled less than $25,000. Losses totaled more than $25,000, U.S. or U.S. equivalent. I don't know. So those are a couple of the numbers, and we're going to let those tally for a bit. So thank you for everyone who responds. Some people don't like to respond to polling questions. We still like you, but we appreciate it more if you respond and everybody can see what the broader audience is looking at. So I'd like to have a few more responses if I could. So we're going to broadcast them now while you can still keep taking the poll. So very few have had no attempts. That's actually exciting that there are some that haven't had attempts. Attempts but no losses, 32%. So roughly a third have had no attempts or attempts but no losses. A quarter, the losses have been less than $25,000. That's still quite good considering the environment. Losses more than 25K, about 1 in 7. And then fully a quarter of the respondents aren't sure, don't know. This is usually not shared broadly in an organization, so your area may not have much, or you may not be aware of what's going on in the organization. So that is some interesting information. So very few have had no attempts. Quite a few don't know or don't understand. So the visibility to that is pretty muted in about 1 in 4 companies. Excellent. And then, about 1 in 5, I guess we're almost at 1 in 6, between 1 in 5 and 1 in 6 have had losses greater than 25K in the last 12 months. So we're going to move that poll off the screen, and thank you for responding to that. We really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. It's like a mini survey that's instantaneously done in context. So this screen here says, have you experienced fraud in the last 12 months? This is from the large Treasury Fraud and Control survey that we have. And just so you know, this survey is available from our website. You can find that under the surveys. You can download the infographic, the report. There's a lot of information you can get, so that's free to download and to access. Feel free to grab that. I think that's also available on Bottom Line's website too. So you can go there if you'd like. So have you experienced fraud in the last 12 months? This is the longitudinal part of our survey. We've taken this particular survey 3 years in a row. So what was the experience when we exclude the I'm unsure responses? So it's just taken off of the number of people who didn't have any or did. Have you experienced fraud? It went from 40% in 2016, 52% last year, to 57% this year. That's not a particularly encouraging trend unless you're in the crime business to say, hey, we're making good progress. But for all of those of us, or hopefully all those of us on the line, we're looking to deflect, prevent, and diminish the amount of fraud. So this is continuing to expand. And the reason for this is that there's money in it. The criminals are more persistent, they're automated, and they're patient. They can gather information and make attacks. They're not just trying to steal data, they're trying to steal money. They're trying to get you to send money. And the reason this is having such a payday for them has to do with automation and ability to penetrate organizations and the intellectual defenses of a company or a institute for higher education. They're getting better yields, they're taking a lot more money out of it, and they're having a greater impact because through automation and some tools, they're able to touch a lot more organizations in a very negative way and perpetrate fraud, cause losses, and continue that activity. So let's think about and look at, have you experienced any of these over the past 2 years? The prior question only looked at a 1-year look back. This one looks back over 2 years. I just want you to look at this on the screen and think about this for a few moments. Now we say some attempts and no success is yellow. The yes, we suffered a loss is the orange, and yes, we suffered a loss, and at least one person was terminated or let go. So the red elements are these are new questions. We didn't ask about people letting go. We found that some organizations were placing higher expectations on the bursar's office, on treasury groups, on finance areas to protect the organization, and if a loss occurred, they may hold them accountable if it was deemed that they should have put in commercially reasonable procedures, standards of good corporate conduct, or fixed an issue that they had experienced before. And I have I won't call it a story, but there was a company that's fairly close to where we're located outside of Atlanta. They had been hit with a business email compromise attempt. It was very convincing. The payment almost made it out. It was stopped at the last minute, almost by luck. The CEO told the CFO, get that fixed, put in the right controls, don't let that happen again. 6 to 9 months later, someone came in with a better attempt at business email compromise, and money left, $250,000 left, and the CFO also had to leave the organization. And that person, he was hoping to have 6 more years of work, but that ended. So a sad story for the person, not a good story for the organization. But what we're seeing is people are held accountable much more tightly. And I'll be interested to see how this flows through to the next year in terms of responsibility and accountability. The most interesting, element there on the far left is business email compromise, where I try to spoof you into thinking I am someone else when I email. So you think I'm the CEO or an executive that says make a payment, send money, do this activity. They've gotten very sophisticated. You call it imposter fraud, social engineering, business email compromise, whatever the method is. 63% had attempts but no losses. And you look at the ones that had, yes, we suffered a loss. 11% of organizations suffered a loss in the last 2 years through that attempt, despite all of the discussion about it. So people are either not listening, they're not listening to the new elements, they're being caught unawares when the criminals have stepped up their game significantly. They may have compromised the email, they have a dialogue, and you become convinced it's the person, not with a one-time exception item, but with an ongoing dialogue that happens. So the level of success has increased pretty significantly in the success here, despite the training, despite the information in the news articles on this. And you can see the different elements across the screen. But one of the elements I wanted to talk to about briefly was the wire fraud, system-oriented payment. I'm stealing credentials, or I'm gaining access to a system. I'm altering payment information, so a payment goes to an account that I, the criminal, control. And once it gets there, I can move it because I control or have compromised that system. I can then move that money somehow out of the banking system or onto other accounts that we control and can extract funds out of the regular banking system into some other method. So very, very disconcerting, the number of attempts and the number of actual losses. Now, some of those, when you look at business email compromise attempts, you may have 20 of those attempts in a particular year, and you didn't fall for any, which is awesome. But the persistence and the frequency is tremendous in a bad way. So let's look at the criminal's playbook. How do they follow and attempt to create fraud and gain financially from this? So I'm going to talk about this chart. I'll go from top to bottom. The top is what's the best way for them. If I can steal funds directly as a criminal, that's great. I control the when and the where. If I control your system, I control the checks, I can steal it directly. The second way is to fool you into getting you to send funds or to make a payment. The third is if I can't get funds, I can get data that has value, and then I can sell that data. Maybe I can sell it multiple times. It might be medical data, it might be card data, but if I can take large amounts of data, sell it on the dark web, I can make some money. And then finally, maybe I can't steal or lift your data to sell. Maybe I can just lock up your data for ransom, whether it's on a hard drive on a local computer, whether it's a network. I can lock it up and then force you to pay me through Bitcoin or some other virtual currency and make off with money because you need access to your system, particularly effective with hospital systems. So if you understand their intent and their general approaches, that should give you a better basis for applying some of the different security principles we're going to talk about. And second, we can identify where to look, or the ability to identify where to look for potential problems will be enhanced. So let's just talk through a couple of these briefly. At the top, steal funds directly. We've got 1, 2, 3 across the board. Check forgery, the payout, it's more on the left side. You can see at the top it says low payout. Check forgery losses tend to be around $1,600 in the U.S. based upon FBI data. So it's between $1,000 and $2,000 on average. There's a number of services that your banks tell you you need and you do, that you probably employ, that restrict the amount of losses that occur because you use positive pay or pay match positive pay. Check forgery is really easy. It's like the poor man's criminal. You can get some check stock, make it out, buy somebody's check, and submit different checks, forge or wash those checks. It's pretty easy to get in that business. That's not an encouragement. It's just a notice. The ACH fraud or personal payment systems, I can use some of these highly efficient individual systems to, say, try to debit my account for paying for utilities or services, whatever, but I can take and put someone else's account information in there. If they're not doing enough checking and validation, the charge may go against a corporation's, a school, someone else's account, and they may not notice it until they've done their reconciliation and seen what's happened. So I might be able to plug that in and have money come out to my benefit for services based upon compromising ACH fraud element there. I'm not even penetrating the system. I'm just plugging in information for a new type of service. And the third one is the one that is the most disconcerting. There are examples of system fraud where people have penetrated crime rings. Even nation-state actors have penetrated banks, penetrated organizations, managed to compromise almost every area of their system. And by doing so, they can submit transfer requests. They can also hide some of the confirmation activity that comes in, so it prevents discovery. And this level of system fraud, whether it's initiating payments, whether it's alternating an ACH payment file, like here's the ABA and account number and the amount. Maybe I don't change the amount. I just change the bank address and the bank account number. So now it goes to an account that I control. Once it gets there, I can move it on. I just need time to make sure it settles and clears. With wire transfers, they tend to be irrevocable and quick and final from a legal standpoint, but usually they still require some time, usually more than a day, to move the money into accounts that I can lift out of the banking system before those accounts get frozen. So the top one is, can I steal funds directly? That is an awesome way to do it if you're a criminal. You control the whole game. You're not dependent on fooling someone else. You make your timing and your moves at just the right time, right before Thanksgiving, right before a long weekend. Then you have as much time to move them out of the banking system as possible, taking advantage of countries where the banks are open on Saturdays or Sundays, while if you're in the U.S., maybe they're closed then, but you pulled it out right before Thanksgiving, and nobody's going to see that until the Monday afterwards. The second is getting you to send funds. It's some type of business email compromise or some phone compromise. It's basically a method of being an imposter to convince someone to follow directions that you normally would or that you might because they're in a position of authority. So whether you call it CEO fraud, business email compromise, imposter fraud, if I gain control of your business email and send information and instructions, especially if I'm patient, I can see how correspondence works, see how requests for funds transfer may come in. I copy, I learn that, and then when the time is right, I can send an instruction that says this is urgent, keep it confidential, move money here for this deal, this situation, don't tell anyone because confidentiality is of utmost importance. We see that time and time and time again, and you saw that 12% of firms had suffered a loss in the last 2 years of this method of spoofing. Now, it's not just business email. We have seen examples of business email plus phone system, where the PBX was compromised. So they looked and tracked and saw that when the CEO was going to travel, they had access to email or similar email, saw when the flight was, and then made a call through the company's PBX system to the person they had identified who could enact a transfer, said, I'm going to send you instructions about a payment that has to go out really quickly. You need to do it. I'm flying out of the country. Then they go ahead and send an email with those instructions. And if the person calls back, is the CEO there, the CFO there? No, they've gone on a trip, or they've just left. So it becomes very compelling when you think, oh, I got an email and I got a phone message. So those are some tricky ways. On the other side, the number 4 there, when we talk about master record changes, this is, if I can change the underlying record, great, but usually these are pretty well locked down. Dual controls are in place in many companies, so some type of spoofing occurs. There's situations where someone starts correspondence, they gain enough information about maybe a preferred supplier or maybe one of the largest suppliers, figures out who's associated with who, and someone starts a dialogue, an email dialogue with the head of AP. They share information at different points in time, and then there's the, oh, by the way, we've changed our banking information, move it over here. Then the manager says, okay, we're going to move it because I got it from the email. I know who this person is. We've been communicating for a month, and then lo and behold, it wasn't the person they thought it was, and they had violated their policy because they, quote, knew who they were talking with. Very significant. The third level here, taking data and selling it, this concept of if I steal data, especially card data or health data, there's value to selling it because people can make money on the sale of that data or that card information for theft or additional personnel compromise. So a data breach is usually some type of PII or personally identifiable information. And since that's the case, they will take it and sell it. There are many examples of large amounts of data that have been lifted and sold. You're familiar with all the large data breaches that hit the news, including credit union data, credit checking systems that have suffered compromises. You've seen that with the U.S. government. Very significant and distressing to those that have lost that data. But that's pretty common. They'll take it and sell it on the dark web, sell it multiple times. Finally, ransomware is locking something down. Just a few months ago, the city of Atlanta had a press conference. They had been attacked by ransomware that impacted some of their systems that morning, and they had identified that it hadn't impacted the health first responder systems, but had impacted some of the ways where you self-serve and pay for taxes or licensing. So it took them a significant amount of work to get that cleaned out of the system. But the two elements there in terms of just sending something that is an encryption tool that locks up your hard drive on a one-to-one basis, like I'm sending it and targeting you. There's also 2 more efficient methods, ransomware via worm and ransomware as a service. The worm is if I can create this ransomware that will lock your stuff down, and then you will go ahead and be directed to a site where you make a payment, then I'm very efficient because now it spreads and self-perpetuates because this worm will move from system to system. If it can get far enough before being discovered, I may make a significant amount of money before I have to unlock your hard drive if you pay me, or maybe I don't even have to give you the code to unlock it because I'm a criminal and I don't care. Ransomware as a service is the idea of the multi-level marketing. Maybe I'm good at creating ransomware. I create the code, but I make it so that others can use it. They can put their own information in it. They can deliver it and come up with creative messages to get people to download this dangerous payload and lock it up, and then I get a cut of, I either get a fee for doing it or I get a percentage of the take so that they can share in the profit. So these are some of the methods of using technology to better surveil or to increase the yield and effectiveness of the attack. So those are some of the worst parts of the criminal playbook, and there's a lot of variations on these major plays, if you will. So our next intensive slide, thank you for staying awake through this. Our next intensive slide is the fraud battlefield, and it might not be as clear that you can see 4 areas to this, or there are 4 that we'll talk about. So the left-hand side at the top, you have the organization, perimeter, interior. I'm just going to talk to those for a minute. You're inside Systems and elements there may vary dramatically, but the concept is you have a perimeter where things like firewalls, antivirus block things from entering your domain. Just like a fort of old, it provided something at the border, not letting people in. We protect the front door of the building. We protect the front door of all the electronic portals and elements that are open. So protecting that is table stakes, the price of admission, keeping those current, industrial strength. There's also the element of the interior, making sure that your interior is protected, that it's not only focused on the outside wall, and once someone's in, then they have free game. There must be elements within there, and there are some principles, and there are some tools that help with that, and we will talk about that. So, for example, when I think about the interior, where can you have a problem? So you have payment files created. They're sitting on a drive. Someone can go edit them, or maybe they even have to edit them because there's a problem with them. They take those and then load them to a bank portal or move them to an area that will be, an FTP connection, will transport it to the bank. Those files may not be encrypted. They may not be hash totaled. So someone can edit the payment information, not even changing the payee, for example. And in the normal course of the delivery of that payment instruction to the bank, those items will be delivered and be redirected to the accounts that the criminals want them to, which are accounts they control because they've hacked other elements and other systems and other people. So managing that access is important. It's not just do we trust everyone, but have we made it so that if one ID is compromised, that's not enough to change payment file information. You can trust everyone, but if someone has been compromised, their system or credentials have been compromised, you have a single point of failure that may have nothing to do with the integrity of the person, but it has to do with too many and too much permission. So a number of items there. You can see them on the bottom, some of the security elements that we look at. That's just a beginning list of some of the elements that most organizations look at, everything from desktop hygiene to encrypting data at rest, maybe even tokenizing key elements of data so the data is actually not there. It's a token that other piece of data is stored elsewhere. That covers the first two, and on the right-hand side we have the exterior environment. So there's two elements here. The one is the access or the transport. I'm passing data back and forth, perhaps to my bank, my custodian, other partners. And that access and that delivery point is crucial. So to make sure that those messages, those transmissions are not compromised, that's another area to pay close attention to. Even if you're not IT, it's very important that you understand these are the different areas where your files, your data can be exposed or the levels of control can be compromised. So making sure that it is both commercially reasonable, meets the minimum standard of good corporate conduct, leverages things like encryption, hashing, and it's very secure across the board. And then finally, the third parties that you use, whether they're treasury management systems, your banks, et cetera, you're passing data to and from them. You may be avoiding or eliminating controls that the banks, for example, have recommended and set up as a good standard, and you waive that control and think everything is going to be fine. So there are certainly some key elements to that exterior environment. Every door to the outside is a potential exposure. I'll just give you one example to that. And I don't know if anybody is on from South Korea, but the South Korean military had a breach because they were doing an update to one of the networks that's completely off the internet. But to do the update, they connected it to the internet for purposes of patching and upgrading the system. Well, the person who did that left it connected. North Korea eventually took advantage of that and was able to download extensive amount of data, and that created some problems. So you can imagine that from a military standpoint, from a financial standpoint, these are all concerns that we have to watch at every level of an organization. So with that, what are some of the Treasury components, human versus technology. On the left-hand side, you're familiar with many of these, biometrics, your fingerprint, your eye, your retina. You have encryption. You confuse the data, you lock it up, you replace it with a token, that's tokenization. There's different security components like SAML2. This is the single sign-on feature, so your Windows permissioning rights are then replicated with a third party like a TMS. So if you remove someone off of your in-house database of rights and access, it'll immediately suspend that service with a third-party provider. And there's a range of monitoring tools, antivirus software, firewall, but all of those are very effective security components. And it does make sense as a bursar, finance person, treasurer, to understand what tools are there, what ones are you using, what ones should you be using, even if you're not in charge of implementing these throughout the organization, even if that's owned by IT. Now, on the right-hand side, the human security components, I wanted to mention a few things. So if you look at the top, security training on a regular basis, we believe there's enough change going on it bears repeating, and there's enough losses going on. The security training should be formal. It should be regular, at least annual, and it should be testable. It should be tested. You should make sure that people are not just saying, yeah, I watched the video, or I clicked through this, or I read the book, sort of. There should be testing to ensure comprehension is at least sufficient, hopefully better, and you can see how that's working. So security training is essentially a must in our view, given what's going on today. There might be testing on phishing emails. That's a lot more common than some of the security training we think makes the most sense about payments and controls and attack vectors they use. You certainly need to make sure you're not opening emails that give people into your system, whether it's a phishing email, they're dropping a 16 gig thumb drive that says payroll on it, or whatever that people will pick up and then want to see what's on it and stick it in their computer, downloading a dangerous payload. And then as we move down, we have things like a clean desk policy, dual controls, which most people are familiar with pretty well, and segregation of duties, principle of least privilege, some different elements that help an organization pick what's going on. And we'll go through the 12 security principles, of which some of these items fall under. So with that, what are the security considerations, IT versus Treasury? So if you're in finance at the bursar's office, please, in your mind, replace Treasury with those areas. But just a couple areas to think about. On the left-hand side, you have IT. Their core responsibility is to protect the data, protect access, make sure it's efficient. So they're looking at how do we manage the sensitive data, where do we store data, what's already on every machine to provide protection. And given that exists, they are looking at the perimeter, making sure the codes and the strings are being updated, and that people are practicing things well. They manage third-party vendors. What rights do you grant them? How do you restrict them if they're coming into your system? Do you keep them in the sandbox? Do you keep them in a non-core area? How does that work? So there are key elements for the IT group to manage the perimeter. That is part of their core activity. Now, Treasury, Finance, the bursar's office, et cetera, cannot or should not just say that's somebody else's responsibility to protect cash, to protect my payments, et cetera. They must take I'll call it a superintendent look. They don't have to teach every class, but they should know what's going on in their school or in the area or context of payments, secure data that needs to be managed, particularly in AP, payroll, Treasury, these elements. So this is the concept of I'm making sure I have the right type of vendors that support some of these security protocols and not abdicate to IT, taking a very active role and saying we should have a high level of security, and that will include these elements to support these principles. And we'll work with our banks, our third-party vendors, to make sure that's the case. It also involves, when you think about where you store things on the network, the segregation of duties may be well enforced against Treasury or AP people to access those, and then forgotten to be observed for what happens from an IT perspective or a system admin perspective. There might be 3 or 4 IDs that have full range of the system where these payment files are. So the compromise of any of those IDs means that the payment file can be compromised and a loss can be achieved relatively easily, even though you lock down access to master record data. Well, you have a good link to the bank, you've created an exposure, you've allowed an exposure. Treasury needs to be aware of that. So let's continue on as we continue to move through our hour together. So how do we look at fraud prevention and security? What do we need to do? What are some of the things that are essential for our organization if we're saying we want to secure Treasury, payments, our most liquid assets? Well, every organization or most organizations have some type of framework, whether it's COSO, NIST, it could be something with SWIFT like the Customer Security Program, a security framework. It could be PCI DSS for those that hold and process card information. But the concept is that they go ahead and understand that there is an overall framework. And from that framework, there are different policies that need to flow out of that. What do you do specifically? And those policies should be informed by the general framework, but also some of the key security principles. And we've identified the top 12 security principles across the board, and we'll talk through a couple of those. So things from everything from speed matters to deleting data and removing it. We're going to focus more on those blue items, and if you can't quite make the distinction between the blue and the gray, they're bolded as well. So 7, 8, 9, and 11 are the bold elements. So the secure clamps, the 12 security principles from speed matters. Speed matters from how fast you reconcile to how quickly you follow up if you've had a loss. So preventative and detective elements there, all the way down to removing or deleting data so it's no longer available to be stolen. But with that, we'll move on to dual controls. Many are familiar with this term. Dual controls make sure that more than one person or more than one ID are required to generate, approve a payment, change a vendor master record, pay information, setting up a transfer or repetitive at the bank. So that's crucial. So one element is, how do you compromise that? As a criminal, you want to take one out. You want to compromise a particular control or a particular ID. So, it's not an issue of do you trust people. The concept is, what if one ID is compromised? Will that ID by itself be able to compromise the organization or create a loss? So this is important to think about, in that a small organization may not have many people to do this, and so an individual may have a lot of rights. And because of that, even if they're the most trustworthy person, they're as pure as the driven snow, someone can gain control of their credentials. That's at least one aspect to be concerned about. Second, oftentimes the segregation of duties in the dual control is relegated to the operational side, so it might be finance or treasury. Those segregated duties are laid out very quickly and specifically, but it may not be as defined from an IT perspective, the watchers, if you will. So making sure that one ID by itself can't enact changes to every single payment file, and then you find out later that all the money's gone, and there's a problem. So it's really the concentrating power in one hand. Interesting that 9 out of 10 organizations require dual controls for all transactions. 1 out of 10 had at least one exception for that. So I think everyone knows that's not a leading principle. So the second principle we're going to just focus on briefly today has to do with layers and multi-factor authentication. So layers of security is a principle that each one provides protection, and if one layer happens to get compromised, the other layers will still prevent the attack from succeeding. Now, criminals want to remove those layers piece by piece over time, and since they do that, The idea of you can't just say, oh, I've got 4 layers, I don't care if some of them are compromised. Each layer needs to be appropriate and needs to be protected. And given that, that's a key portion of how an organization protects it. So one layer, another layer might be multi-factor authentication. If someone compromised your ID and password because they captured it with a camera, they watched over your shoulder, or they guessed your dog's name, there are other factors that can be brought into play. And you're probably using these on your personal accounts. They're sending a PIN to your phone. You're using some type of RSA token, maybe a soft token on your computer, or there's some other method like a fingerprint, an iris scan, etc. So there's different ways of doing that. So a lot of banks, for example, use those. Physical fobs, an RSA, secure ID, or some other method where there's a number that's changing. So you have to have the ID password and a changing token. So this idea of multi-factor authentication or additional layers is a key area that needs to be enforced across the board. And it's interesting to see organizations might have 5 of 6 payment systems with multi-factor authentication and the 6th not. And that's a point of exposure. And where do you think that's going to, where there's going to be a problem? It's going to be the ones with less points of protection. So I'll move along to the same concept, but looking at some results. What are people doing with additional layers of protection? So I'm looking at some bank services in the right-hand side graph. We asked about how many organizations use certain types of services like ACH positive pay. Well, 2/3 do. Check positive pay or pay match positive pay. Almost 4 out of 5 use check positive pay, and pay match positive pay is that use that higher level of service where you also match on the pay information. That's 3 out of 5, or almost 60%. And if you look at some of the elements there, you can read those just as well as I can say them. So I'll leave them be for the moment. But let's look at the next principle, which is the principle of least privilege. This is kind of like loose lips sinks ships. The concept of you don't need to share information. You should only share information with the people that need it. And that's, you can think of that in a couple ways. Should you leave your bank account statements, your company's or your organization's bank account statements on the desk in the open? And you're saying no, but how many do that? We see that all the time. It's also the concept of, it's a principle of least privilege if you think, oh, I only need to protect the perimeter, not what's inside on my desk, or once you're inside on the network, you can see, everyone can see Treasury's information, finances information, et cetera, which has a lot of very useful information and data for criminals to understand the organization, to see where balances are, where the money is. There's a number of elements there. So the idea of least privilege is reduce access to that data only to those who need that privilege. So what's the least amount of data you need access to do your job? That's all you should get. And that's the concept, and that is violated so much. I mean, people are used to dual controls, but the principle of least privilege is very much understated in many, many organizations. So things like access to file, access to vendor master records, access to bank data, all represent a significant control problem. Now, as we continue on that, what are some of the results of surveys that show what's going on? I think there's some good news there that a lot of organizations, about half in some instances, employ the principle of least privilege for bank authority, access to confidential corporate data, et cetera. So I'm saying I'm encouraged because it's about half, but you also look and you say that should probably be close to 100% on those items. So that's a significant element. A quarter didn't know what that principle was. It's not really talked about much. So that is something to think about. How are you restricting data, information, access to everything from accounts to significant financial information to only those that need to know it? So 36% either didn't know or they don't know what it means. So since that's the case, this is definitely an area for significant improvements in how you protect your organization. So if someone compromises an ID and they only have access to what they need as opposed to free range, much more significant. So when I'm compromising a Big Four consulting firm, what did they compromise? They compromised the system administrator's credentials because that gave them complete free reign in the organization. Very, very significant issue. So let's look at another one, which is dedicated and regular security training. And what we mean by this, we need to treat the human mind and our staff and our team just like we do with our software. We update the software, we update the hardware to make sure that our firewalls are blocking what they need to. The same is true of the human mind. We need to make sure we're staying current on what's going on in the industry. We don't get an upload like you do in the Matrix, where all of a sudden you can fly a new plane simply by loading the program into the head, but we do need to have training to make sure we can stay current on what are people experiencing, how do these attacks look, what are the attack vectors that are used, how do we apply these types of principles, what makes the most sense. So there is an element of making sure you're aware of what's going on, how to prevent it, how to protect your organization, and making sure that there is testing on the knowledge and on the practices that are required. So I always think it's very interesting that someone does phishing training and then 2 days later they send test emails, and 18 to 25% of the company employees who took that training 2 days later are clicking on the email messages that are fraudulent. So this is having regular security training that's not only focused on the IT component, but is focused on the different attack vectors and the different playbook elements that are used by the criminals is absolutely essential. Being systematic about it. Hearing a webinar every once in a while is one key component, but having a regular systematic way of training your staff, anybody who's involved in payments, is in Treasury, is finance, in the bursar's office, this should be something that is consistent, regular, and updated. Now, this is the sad news, some of the statistics here. When we look at, hey, do we provide training? Do we do it? For managing phishing clickbait attacks, we do it. A significant number provide occasional communication on what needs to be done. That's about 7 in 10. We provide training on avoiding, 2/3. About a third have test emails sent. They test it, and nothing formally, 10%, unsure, 7%. So even on this is like one of the most used areas or the most trained areas. There's still quite a bit of room. The second is, how do we stay on top of things and what makes sense? So when we say what makes sense, is it a general responsibility to stay on top of fraud? Do we have things specifically assigned where people are monitoring different types of payment fraud, system-level fraud, compromise of personally identifiable information, confidential information, et cetera? But at this point, I want to take 2 polls at once. I'd like you to take 2 polls at once. We're going to slide those over. The first is a poll on, do you have a formal security training program in place? And so this is, the answers are no and not considering one, no but considering one, yes, but it only focuses on the basic elements, email, clean desktop, don't stick thumb drives, yes, and it covers various fraud techniques and payment issues. In other words, it's very comprehensive about different methods of stealing money, altering payment files, encryption, different principles. So you can go ahead and answer that. The second one is, how do you stay current on security topics for Treasury payments? The bottom one, you can see that they're squares instead of circles. You can select more than one. So go ahead and select all of those that you do. We look at podcasts, videos, etc. While you're answering those, just focus on that. When you're done, I do want to invite you again to subscribe to our podcast. We'll paste that into the screen again. And also follow Strategic Treasure on LinkedIn with the link that's there. We'll stick that in the chat box. You can click on that. If you go to the LinkedIn Treasury Security Group, we'll get you approved today. But would be delighted if you guys followed the Treasury Update podcast. We put out podcasts each week. So let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing the results quickly. The top is you have a formal security program? No, and not considering one, about 1 in 12. No, but considering one, about double that, so about 1 in 6. Yes, but only focus on the basic elements, a quarter. Yes, and it covers various fraud techniques and payment elements, almost half. So almost half are in the category that we would consider good there. So thank you for those that answered that one. So we'll move that one off. Then at the bottom, I'm going to show the results for poll question 3. How do you stay current? Number 1, webinars like this one. Thank you for joining and staying current. I think there's a little bias because we're giving this poll question on a webinar, but don't tell anyone about that. The internal IT security resources, 70% are using that. Massive, and that's effective. Conference sessions, almost half, a little over half. Almost 6 out of 10 are articles and blog posts. Podcasts is 15%, so hopefully after today, this audience will increase that because we do cover a lot there. And then videos like YouTube, almost 20%. So we're going to move that off the screen. And thank you for responding to those poll questions. So we got a couple more things and one final poll question, and then a few interesting things at the very end. So as you look at key takeaways, I think the key elements, I'm not going to read all this, but you know the crime level has escalated. It's far more automated, and they're attacking organizations. This means the defense of IT, people's minds, and the different principles that they employ have to be more significant. Since that's the case, since they're more sophisticated, persistent, it's escalated, our defense has to be better in each of those areas. And one area we wanted to focus on today is staying current with controls, getting the type of training that is necessary to ensure your whole team is staying up. If 2 people in Treasury are masters at it and AP and IT is not staying up on all of those elements that Treasury needs, you're going to have gaps. Any weak link in people can have a problem. So the response has to include both the human element, the service element, and the technology element. So services from your banks all sit together. And the last point there is taking proactively. Don't wait until there's a crime and then you're trying to close it and say we couldn't have anticipated that. Assume you're constantly under attack and figure out what to do for that. Now, I want to take the last polling question here. We have just a few more minutes. This polling question is for fraud and security webinars. I would like, this is select all that applies, more details of real fraud incidents, to know what others are doing for payment security, to understand leading practices for protecting personally identifiable information, to better understand how criminals attack an organization, to understand important security principles besides like a common one like segregation of duties. So feel free to plug those away. I'm going to advance the slide while we're keeping the poll live. And I just wanted to point out a couple things before Michelle closes us out. I want to thank PDG for inviting people, particularly our bursar and higher ed Treasury friends, to today's webinar. There is a national conference. We'll move the poll question to the right just a bit while people are answering that. It's in March. It's in San Antonio. It's 2019. You'll get a copy of the slide. You can click on there now to learn more, and you can get that. So I invite you to go there. I'll be joining them at that venue as well. I'm looking forward to it and meeting you. So with those, we're going to move the poll question off. And I did want to talk about one other item that you can just look and listen to. So we do have a Treasury Security online video course. It has testing. It contains many, many components. For those that are looking at more, we'd invite you to visit our website, send a note, and we'll follow up with you if you'd like to learn more about that type of training that covers more than just the IT components, helps you stay current. We're also adding things on the PCI DSS. It meets the requirements of much of the 7.2 of the SWIFT CSP elements that are required, so I'm happy to share more there. With that, I want to turn it back over to Michelle for final closing comments and information about the webinar. And thank you for spending time with us this afternoon or late morning, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig, for a very informative presentation. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. I do have several announcements, so bear with me for just a second. We will stay online for a few more minutes in case there are any last-minute questions. We would really appreciate your feedback on our webinars. If you head back to the registration page, you can leave a quick anonymous review. I've also posted the link in the chat box. If you don't see the review form, please refresh your page. Again, thanks everyone for joining us today. We will send the credit forms, a copy of the deck, and the recording within the next few days. Please let us know if you have any questions and continue checking our website for upcoming webinars.